Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. We're nearly to the end of November, and on BookTube there's been nonfiction November going on all month. I've been reading Herodotus, which sort of counts. But I've just been so busy with work and life and just things in general that I have not been checking any events or challenges or prompts or any of that. But I saw sort of tangentially, hey, the memoirs are included, and I thought, okay, there's one I'm going to read this month. I'm going to include that. So I will link Olive at a Book Olive's channel and announcement in the description box. She's been running this event since before I became a parent. So the memoir that I read is the slave narrative of William Wells Brown from 1847. So it's published just 2 years after Frederick Douglass. You know, his narrative, the narrative of his life sort of just explodes in 1845 and is read in many places by many people, and kind of lights this like firecracker on, you know, the horrors of slavery. William Wells Brown also published his narrative as written by himself, you know, a man who had been enslaved and yet learned to become literate, learned to read and write, and was able to write out his narrative and his, you know, the narrative of his escape, you know, sort of contemporaneous with Frederick Douglass. William Wells Brown, both of them published from Boston. They both knew William Lloyd Garrison, who sort of like, you know, was very active in those abolitionist societies there in Boston, Massachusetts, throughout the 1840s and 1850s, and then, you know, even into the Civil War and its aftermath. But there are some key differences in the narrative from William Wells Brown. One is that Douglass was very explicit about he didn't want to talk about his successful escape at all, because he knew that slave owners, slave overseers, slave hunters were all more literate than the slaves, and so he didn't want to give away the game, give away any hints around what had helped him be successful in his escape. William Wells Brown's narrative does involve quite a few details around his escape, like a sort of almost like the final third of the narrative, and is focused on his different attempts to escape. The second difference is really crucial, and it's why, you know, this narrative, I think, works as a really good complement to what Douglass wrote, and that is that Douglass lived in Maryland and spent a lot of time in Baltimore, like in the city there, and saw all of the horrors of slavery and wrote extremely articulately around each of those horrors, and was very good about, like, they say this, here's what really happens. They say this, here's what really happens, and just, you know, tears down those ideas. William Wells Brown was born in Kentucky but lived in Missouri, primarily in St. Louis, and part of his life in his first 19 years as an enslaved human was he worked on steamboats that went down the Missouri and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans with slaves as part of the slave trade. So he was a first-hand witness to a whole other set of horrors that Douglass talks about and hints at, like the terrors of the slave trade, but he himself wasn't quite experiencing it in the same, he wasn't witnessing the same things. They were both experiencing the same horrors of slavery. Douglass wasn't witnessing quite all of the details of the slave trade that William Wells Brown did. And so that's part of why his narrative is such a powerful piece, is it shows just the deep level of inhumanity and evil that was involved. So it starts in, I mean, there's no, the cover's ripped off right away. The bandage is ripped off right away. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky. The man who stole me as soon as I was born recorded the births of all the infants which he claimed to be his property in a book which he kept for that purpose. My mother's name was Elizabeth. She had 7 children, Solomon, Leander, Benjamin, Joseph, Milford, Elizabeth, and myself. No 2 of us children were of the same father. My father's name, as I learned from my mother, was George Higgins. He was a white man, a relative of my master, and connected with some of the first families in Kentucky. And that's where it just goes off right away. You know, Wells Brown details, I was stolen at my birth. Like I was born a human being, and immediately, like, my life and future were stolen from me, and I was enslaved. And there's also that bit around, you know, many of the slaves who were part of the slave trade were born out of assaults on enslaved women by white men. And so he goes through some of his experiences, and goes through, you know, what his experiences were like as a young man, and seeing, just as Douglass did, the horrors of families that are just ripped apart. You know, there will be a couple who have fallen in love. They're both slaves, but they've fallen in love. They found that tiny bit of happiness. One of them is sold. He talks about they ring a bell. They get up at 4. By 4:30, they have to be in the field. Anybody who's late is whipped. And he goes into details around what those experiences were like as a very young boy, hearing what was going on. And that because his father had been white, he was allowed to like work. He was a slave in the house. Sometimes he uses the word servant, but that's, as soon as you can read between the lines, they were still slaves. He didn't have freedom. And they weren't taught to read or write or anything like that. They would be whipped if they spilled, the cup of wine or whatever while carrying it. And so he details those, but then he goes on shortly later, and he wants to talk about, and this was a really important piece, he wants to talk about, there was no good place to be a slave. That as much as they thought about the Deep South being super scary and terrifying, there was no good place to be a slave. He goes, though slavery is thought by some to be mild in Missouri when compared with the cotton, sugar, and rice-growing states, yet no part of our slaveholding country is more noted for the barbarity of its inhabitants than St. Louis. It was here that Colonel Harney, a United States officer, whipped a slave woman to death. It was here that Francis McIntosh, a free colored man from Pittsburgh, was taken from the steamboat Flora and burned at the stake. During a residence of 8 years in this city, numerous cases of extreme cruelty came under my own observation. To record them all would occupy more space than could possibly be allowed in this little volume. And those are true events. Francis McIntosh was a free man who was employed on a steamboat, and when he was off of the boat in St. Louis, he was shouted at to help apprehend some fugitive slaves, and just kind of stood there. And so they then decided to arrest him, and they were going to imprison him for years. He tried to break free and escape, and a mob later broke into the jail cell where he was and burned him alive. And he was screaming during the events, I am like you, I can feel pain, please shoot me. And they did not. And so like deeply evil, horrifying things going on. William Wells Brown describes as a slave, he was tasked with serving, being enslaved on a riverboat that would take, other people who were part of the slave trade. Because his father was white, he was repeatedly told, you won't be sold south, you won't be sold to a slave trader. But he had to serve on the boat and, go and give food and he describes how they're penned in, and they would, if it was an older men or older women, they would shave their hair so that they couldn't see the gray, or like pluck the hair so they couldn't see gray, and then use blacking to try and cover it so that they looked younger. I mean, just really awful things. One of the most awful is this following incident. Mr. Walker purchased a farm 5 or 6 miles from the city. He had no family, but made a housekeeper of one of his female slaves. Poor Cynthia, I knew her well. She was one of the most beautiful women I ever saw. She was a native of St. Louis and bore an irreproachable character for virtue and propriety of conduct. Mr. Walker bought her for the New Orleans market and took her down with him on one of the trips that I made with him. Never shall I forget the circumstances of that voyage. On the first night that we were on board the steamboat, he directed me to put her into a stateroom he had provided for her, apart from the other slaves. I had seen too much of the workings of slavery not to know what this meant. I accordingly watched him into the stateroom and listened to hear what passed between them. I heard him make his base offers and her reject them. He told her that if she would accept his vile proposals, he would take her back with him to St. Louis and establish her as his housekeeper at his farm. But if she persisted in rejecting them, he would sell her as a field hand on the worst plantation on the river. Neither threats nor bribes prevailed, however, and he retired, disappointed of his prey. And so the next night, Cynthia finally, decides she does not want to be sold on the worst plantation on the river. He took her back to St. Louis, established her as his mistress and housekeeper at his farm, and before I left, he had 2 children by her. But mark the end. Since I have been at the North, I have been credibly informed that Walker has been married, and as a previous measure sold poor Cynthia and her 4 children, she having had 2 more since I came away, into hopeless bondage. And I think that was in the very first paragraph, the idea that there's all of the violence directed towards enslaved men and the mutilations that are described, and the whippings and beatings, and they're just worked to death. But the violence towards women that was present in the first paragraph is reinforced throughout the narrative. And it's really quite horrifying. Brown ultimately sees one of the things that he hesitates on trying to escape to, not just to the north, because he escapes successfully to the north with his mother, who would have been probably like in her early 30s at the time. But they were in Illinois, which was a free state, but a local Illinois resident, so not a slave hunter who had come up from Missouri into Illinois, a local Illinois resident apprehended them and took them back down to St. Louis, where they were jailed, and so escaping to the north isn't enough. They have to escape all the way up to Canada, where they won't be where there aren't fugitive slave laws to allow slave hunters to bring them back down to the south. And so he's hesitant to do that because he doesn't want to leave his sister and his mother behind. But ultimately his sister is sold to slave traders down to New Orleans. His mother, the same thing happens. And so because he can work on steamboats, he's on rivers where the free states are on just the other side. If he can get over there and move at night, follow the North Star, and he talks about that, like looking for the North Star, and it's cloudy, and so he has to just wait out the night, or it breaks at 4 a.m. and so he tries to run several miles and then hide before dawn. But it's a deeply harrowing narrative. It's different from Douglas because Douglas is always pushing this level of who he is. Like Douglas, you see this grasp of, very early on, he recognizes, like, I'm a human being, and not just that I'm a human being, but like each human being is special, and therefore I am a special human being. Like, not this huge ego, but this sense of like the power and individuality that each human being has. And William Wells Brown doesn't necessarily have that type of passion and drive in his narrative, but he exposes this whole other side of horror in the slave trade in a very short reading. Like a person could probably read his entire narrative in about an hour or 2 hours, depending on how fast you read. But it's extremely well written. He does bring in some of the things around, that in the South, a slave who needed to be whipped, like in the city, they could send the slave, who often couldn't read, with a note saying, like, give this boy or this man or this woman 20 lashes or 40 lashes, and here's the pay for it, to the city jail, and the city jailers would beat them. Brown describes an incident where he's assaulted with like the butt of a whip, and he's beaten so badly that he's bleeding out of his nose and ears and is like bedridden. And so like there's all of those deep horrors. The idea that slaves who'd escaped, they would have chains put on, and they would just be left on to the level that it would mortify the flesh, and they might like lose the use of the limb or lose the limb itself. And he finally does escape. He happens, going north through Ohio, he happens into a Quaker man named Wells Brown, who feeds him, gives him some money and provisions. He's able to get up to Cincinnati, and ultimately he becomes a riverboat man up across Lake Erie, and he will ferry fugitive slaves for free over to Canada. And William Wells Brown helps. I think by his count he had 60. He had some amount, something like 60. I can look it up. Yeah, 69 in 1 year. In another year, there were 17 in just one small town that he knew. And so he becomes very involved in like the Underground Railroad and helping fugitive slaves escape. He was kind of a rival of Douglas. Like later on, they had some disagreements, but it was a great narrative. It's certainly one to think through and read very closely and recognize, what are the things that happen now that, who can be the Quaker in the, Wells Brown in the next thing that's happening in life that needs that person to stand up. How can we each ensure that nothing like that ever happens again? So that was the narrative of the life of William Wells Brown. I highly recommend it. I'll link the video from when I discussed Frederick Douglass, and I'll also try to find a PDF of this narrative and include it as well. But let me know if you've read this, or any thoughts you have. So thank you.